Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Christina Nemr, who is a consultant and entrepreneur addressing challenges in the information environment that yield instability and conflict. She has worked on counter-extremism policy and programming for the past decade in collaboration with governments, civil society, academia, and the private sector, with increasing focus on mitigating the factors that facilitate susceptibility to extremism and disinformation. Christina Nemr, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me, John.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Christina, will cover your expertise on counter-extremism and counter-disinformation. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape?
Sure. I'd like to look at it with a glass half full perspective. There's plenty to get down about when you look at our current information environment and how polluted it is, for lack of a better word. Everything from disinformation and the many variants of it to just misleading information, the polarization that we're seeing, it can be demoralizing. However, I like to take a step back and put things in perspective and think through the fact that, you know, for as long as we've been communicating, we've had misleading information being pushed out one way or another for different reasons by different actors. And I think in the grand scheme of things, we are getting better at addressing it. Technology is moving forward at a pace that is exciting. Of course, there's always a malicious side of technology, but I'd like to think that overall, there are a number of positive factors that cancel out some of that demoralization we might feel about our current environment. So despite our conversation and what we're going to be speaking about in terms of the psychological factors that make us susceptible to these things, I do overall have a very positive outlook on what's to come.
Excellent. So you started your career as an advisor within the U.S. State Department, specifically within the Bureau of Counterterrorism. In fact, you were on the ground floor of that capability standing up, I believe, or the violent extremism program. First of all, what time frame was that? And also, could you just talk about what it was like back in that time?
Yeah, so that would have been around 2010 to 2015. In the Bureau of Counterterrorism. It was a very exciting time because, at least at the State Department, we were standing up the Countering Violent Extremism program. It was the first time we were getting a dedicated budget for it. So there were a lot of things, strategies, policies, programs that we were putting together for the first time. Of course, trying to underpin it all with the research. At the same time, actually, that I started that position, I was completing my master's in forensic psychology. So to be able to apply the psychology to the actual operations was very exciting for me. Towards the end of my time at State, so 2013, 2014, of course, that's when ISIS was rearing its head. So things kind of took a turn for the chaotic, simply because everybody started working on ISIS counter narratives, trying to understand what was happening. So it was less fun at that point, but in those earlier years, there was very much a startup environment, which is rare in government.
I just want to linger for just a moment on your degree, forensic psychology. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about what that degree entails, and where do people tend to work who have degrees in forensic psychology?
A great question. Forensic psychology boils down to the intersection of the law and psychology. So a lot of forensic psychologists might become FBI profilers. If you watch CSI or any of those shows, typically any in that role, a criminal profiler is typically a forensic psychologist. They're also the ones who are giving expert testimony at in cases, especially murder cases, about the state of the murderer. It does involve a lot of researching serial killers, so it can get dark very quickly. And just to give a shout out to so many of my former classmates, a lot of them do end up in positions like at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, trying to understand, track down missing children and the perpetrators of child abuse. So again, not the most uplifting subject, but one that is very necessary.
Yeah, for sure. And so you've deployed some of these educational skills and learnings into the area of counter-extremism and counter-disinformation, presumably. So could you start talking a little bit more about that work in particular? And I don't want to lead the question too much, but you and I, we've had a conversation before we recorded, and so you are making the observation that surprisingly, perhaps to some folks, that these could be considered opposite sides of the same coin. Could you take that in whatever direction you think is productive?
Yeah, I do want to overstate, or I don't want to overstate actually, about the degree to which I was able to use my forensic psychology lessons, simply because forensic psychology really does study the criminal mind. And when you're talking about applying it to extremism and disinformation, things like that, these are things that can happen to any one of us. We're all susceptible to falling into an extremist group or believing disinformation. So in that sense, I do want to delineate between the two.
Yeah.
But in terms of what I've worked on and why I think that the two sides, extremism and disinformation, do tend to be two sides of the same coin. Well, from the beginning of my career, I've looked at what factors lead youth to join extremist groups and how do you mitigate those factors. And it's not typically ideology or religion, as a lot of the thinking was when I was first starting out. There are mainly two buckets of factors, right? There's the structural factors that can push someone, things like group marginalization, corrupt governance, human rights abuses. We see that all over the place. They create the grievances that lead individuals to look elsewhere for justice or opportunity or even a sense of control. And then the second bucket of factors are more of those individual ones. They include things like a search for identity or social status or a feeling of belonging, or even just the presence of a peer network that can pull you in. These buckets of factors, they're not mutually exclusive. Many cases where people were recruited to violent extremism, it was a combination of these factors. And you do see a lot of that also underpinning disinformation or susceptibility to disinformation. So the counter-extremism work that I've done previously did tend to focus on two main things or interventions. First one was to try and give youth alternative outlets for their grievances, maybe like skills or job training, things like that. And the second bucket was largely focused on counter messaging, counter narratives, attempting to discredit the narratives that extremist groups like ISIS or might put out. So between 2016 to 2018, I started exploring more the intersection between extremism and disinformation. When you're trying to tackle extremist narratives and understanding what resonates as a counter message, that just naturally aligns with thinking through approaches to dis or misinformation. So that's why in my mind, I do think there are two sides of the same coin. But to clarify further, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that extremism is always helped along by disinformation, or that the two always beget each other. It's more that where there's smoke, there's fire. To recruit to your cause, you have to get people's attention or dominate the information environment or even maintain the prevailing narrative. But extremism doesn't always lead to violence, nor does disinformation always lead to extremism or violent extremism. But if one of the aims of violent extremism is to sow chaos and undermine trust in government, then spreading disinformation is a pretty effective way to do so. And the
Right.
flip side of that is the more you consume disinformation or biased or misleading information, the more black and white on a topic you can become, which could lead to extremism. Not necessarily violence, but it could lead to that extremist black and white thinking on a topic. So that's how I view them as two sides of the same coin.
I see. Presumably, while at the State Department, you were primarily looking internationally towards groups outside the United States. But have you found that your lessons learned from that period of your professional career apply just as well to groups that can be found domestically?
That's exactly right. Because at the end of the day, these are very human factors of wanting to belong, feeling aggrieved about something. So yes, the State Department work did focus abroad, but the lessons learned are applicable all over the place.
Do gangs fall under the umbrella of extremist groups? I can remember hearing, for several decades now, problems with gangs in the United States, but only in the last maybe 5 years have I been starting to hear the term extremist groups. And it's almost like, well, so gangs are extremist groups, but not all extremist groups are gangs.
Yes, gangs, cults, all of those have provide a lot of lessons learned. In fact, when I was starting off, in that 2010 era, we were reaching out to local law enforcement domestically, especially in the Northern Virginia area. As you well know, there's a huge gang problem. So we were reaching out to understand how they approached mitigating the factors that lead folks to join gangs. And in fact, I'll never forget one story back from that time. Well, as we were thinking through interventions, including using media, right? So pushing out a message, a TV story is always very powerful because it's entertainment and you're learning something. But one local law enforcement officer told me at the time that National Geographic at one point aired a documentary on MS-13 that completely broke down their brutality, the violence, the killings. It was awful. But in the weeks after it aired, they actually saw recruitment to MS-13 increase. They couldn't prove the connection between the airing of the documentary and the recruitment increase, but they were pretty sure it had had something to do with it. So in that sense, this is where you start to think through, why do some interventions fall short? What are you not understanding here?
I'd love to hear more about that. But your example just a minute ago reminds me a little bit of what they call the Streisand effect. Have you ever heard of that?
Yep.
So I'll probably butcher this, but quite a few years ago, maybe this was back, I think, when maybe drones were just starting to become a thing, or maybe this was a satellite image or something, or a picture taken out of an airplane, who knows? But someone took a picture of Malibu Beach and it just happened to be over Barbara Streisand's house. And like I said, I'm going to butcher the story. So somehow this picture got put onto a blog and it wasn't a big deal at all. It was just kind of just happened to be on someone's personal blog page. And somehow Barbara Streisand found out about it, and nobody would have given this any attention whatsoever, except Barbara Streisand made a big deal out of it, and because she made a big deal out of it, everybody found out about it, and it became a big deal because it was highlighted in that way. And it sounds similar to that gang story, in that you try to mitigate a problem, but curiously, your mitigation technique wound up exacerbating the problem, and that probably happens all over the place.
It does, actually, and it's also a problem in the counter-disinformation space when we're thinking through interventions. You don't always need to counter every narrative or every misleading statement. Sometimes you responding to it adds more fuel to the fire where it would have died on its own. The problem is it's very hard to discern what is going to go viral and what isn't. It's a bit of a guessing game. There are a lot of tools out there that try to help us anticipate what will go viral, what won't, but it still is a bit of a guessing game on that front.
Yeah, so I'd like to come back. You mentioned a moment ago talking about interventions. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about, you know, things that are tried, but, you know, address why interventions fall short for various different types of extremism and disinformation?
Absolutely. And I'm going to lean heavily into the psychological research here because it is very illuminating. But essentially, a lot of these interventions fall short because, first and foremost, both extremism and disinformation do not resonate in a vacuum. There are so many different factors that lead to someone feeling a certain way or being attracted to an idea or thought process. And it could be those grievances that I was talking about earlier, the structural ones, the individual ones. So in that sense, you cannot ignore the context when coming up with interventions. This is simply because these grievances create a sense of disillusionment and leave you searching for answers to explain uncertainty. You know, why am I suffering relative to others? Why are things the way that they are? Not knowing what's going to happen or what to do, especially like we've been dealing with the last few years with COVID, right? These elements of uncertainty, it creates and breeds anxiety in many people, depending on their ability to tolerate uncertainty. So that means we're all often searching for answers or meaning or significance in the face of uncertainty. And so in that sense, there are psychological reasons of how we deal with uncertainty that have implications for these interventions. So the research shows that as humans, we're very hardwired to reject uncertainty and ambiguity, to reject anything that doesn't offer immediate and clear answers. So we see this in this context. We see there's a psychologist named Dr. Arie Kruglanski. He calls it cognitive closure, and that in the face of uncertainty or ambiguity, we will seek closure or clarity as quickly as possible. The problem is, in some cases, when we are seeking those quick answers, it makes us susceptible to misleading information or belief systems that provide clear and ambiguous explanations. But that information, it's low-hanging fruit that might be immediately accessible, but it's also black and white, and it's not necessarily allowing for other viewpoints. So then this ties back into the fact that we are not rational consumers of information, right? We crave social belonging and the identity that comes with belonging to a community. And then that reflects in our information intake as well, of course, tied back to our worldview and the grievances that we're dealing with. Online, this means that we'll share content that relates to the identity and the status that we want to project, even if it's false. Research shows that people still share something, even after they were told it was false, simply because they rationalize and say, well, it sounds like something that would happen based on what I believe. And that's where actually repetition wears us down. Disinformation actors are fantastic at repeating the same points over and over again. But when you constantly repeat a false claim, that does increase its believability, even if you know something to be false. So in that sense, we're just dealing with information overload, and we're trying to filter the best way that we can, which inevitably means we are going to bias certain information simply because of, selective exposure or confirmation bias, whatever your favorite cognitive bias is. These are all at play here. And unfortunately, we are tribal about the information that we consume, just like we can be tribal in our social day-to-day interactions. There's fantastic research that shows that if we hold a belief dearly and somebody challenges on that belief, biologically speaking, we react to it the same way we do when facing a dangerous animal. It's that fight or flight. And so to defend against whoever's challenging us, we kind of double down on our belief. So it can be very difficult to push through new information, factual information in that environment.
It seems like there are several components of the human condition and the way the brain works and the way we process information, which have served us well for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, but which are, work against us in some ways towards addressing and mitigating these challenges. I'm curious if critical thinking or somehow educating people in a way differently that we're doing might be part of some way ahead. What are your thoughts there?
That's an excellent question. Critical thinking is a popular intervention, but it does fall short in some ways. There are a few limitations. First, it assumes that the average person will take in information in a vacuum and read it objectively, leaving aside their own emotions and preconceived notions. And as we just discussed, that simply is not going to happen. Secondly, it also assumes that people will be motivated to seek out the tools that they need to ensure that they avoid consuming and sharing misleading or biased information. And there might be some people who do that, but the vast majority of us will not. It's not a knock on any of us. It's just an acknowledgement of human nature and how we deal with information overload. And then a third point here, and just to touch briefly on conspiracy theories, if we can. The interesting thing about conspiracy theorists is that they already consider themselves to be critical thinkers because they're doing their own research and they're not blindly taking as fact what is conventionally believed. In fact, if you follow the QAnon movement, there's a commandment, I think the first commandment, that in the presence of doubt, do your own research. And so it's hard to argue against that. If you're telling everyone, well, do your own research, it simply means that you want people to think critically, but that does not mean that they're going to end up in the place where you want them to be, nor will they necessarily agree with you and what you believe to be right. And so in that sense, critical thinking, I think, is a worthy endeavor, but there are some severe limitations on that front.
Right. It's almost like, one of the problems you described is that if people hear a falsehood enough times, then eventually that falsehood gets like wired in. And if you're just suggesting that, well, if you just think harder about it, it's like thinking harder about it is not necessarily the way ahead. It's that's not going to rewire the circuit necessarily. So, but I mean, this does start begging the question. So, what are some approaches that you think might work? And I mean, what's been your experience here?
There are a few overarching concepts, and then I'll dive into some more concrete examples. But so we established that repetition increases believability, and disinformation actors use this a lot. For those of us pushing out narratives or trying to counter the narratives, we should be using the same technique. Just completely saturate the information environment with the same information over and over again. And then there's actually one simple overarching rule, which is the golden rule. Do not be disparaging or insulting when you push back on certain beliefs, because as we've noted, people's minds will close up if they believe that their beliefs are being attacked. So to kind of dive into some more specific psychological interventions that I've seen used with some impact, there's a concept of attitudinal inoculation. There are researchers out of Cambridge University who are working off of decades-old research, but they've developed interventions that kind of work the same way a vaccine builds resistance to a virus. Their interventions warn people first that they might be exposed to information that challenges their beliefs before they are then presented with some sort of example of misinformation and then something that refutes it. This strategy has been used for climate change, using it on polarized audiences and finding that the climate misinformation was less affected when the participants had received some sort of attitudinal inoculation prior to it. It's also then been used in games. The same group of researchers out of University of Cambridge, working with other civil society organizations, have developed games like Bad News or Harmony Square, which walk you through the tactics of disinformation actors. They actually put you in the role of being a disinformation actor so that you learn all the different techniques and tactics and you're better equipped to handle them when you encounter them in the real world. There have been studies on these games that show that they do accomplish their intended impact, but it's still unclear how long those results hold. Another quick intervention is one that focuses on integrative complexity, which is psychological theory. Well, it's a measure of a person's ability to accept and integrate multiple viewpoints. And it's been operationalized as an intervention across a spectrum of extremism and in a variety of countries. But one way it's been used was in schools in Finland. It offers students the cognitive tools they need to understand conflicts that arise from prejudice or fear, and it gives them communication skills to express themselves. Basically, it's attempting to counter a binary structure of thinking that might lead you to think of us versus them, these types of attitudes that can lead to antagonism and hostility. So those are two quick psychological interventions that have been shown to work on a smaller scale. I do have some other examples actually from work that I did more recently. One quick one arose from a project that I ran on behalf of the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. It arose from a US Africa Tech Challenge event where we identified companies over in Africa that were working on countering disinformation. And essentially this particular project combined two companies. One was a digital entertainment platform called Sea Monster, who worked with iFluence, which is a company that identifies micro-influencers to help you get your message out. And the project was meant to address vaccine hesitancy in South Africa. And to do so, iFluence, based in Kenya, first identified these micro-influencers who had engaged audiences, and it gave them certain talking points and let them tailor the talking points of their audiences to help answer questions about the vaccines and how beneficial they were, giving them the breakdown of the history. And it reached over, I think it was 5 million South Africans. It generated a lot of conversation. I believe it even reduced negative sentiment among the audience from 12% to 9% when it comes to vaccines. So in that sense, that kind of tailored micro conversations has proven to be very beneficial. It's a little better than one-to-one. One-to-one is always the most effective, but if you're trying to scale up, we're working with influencers, knowing because they know where their audiences are. That can be an effective way of trying to reach people, trying to change minds, trying to push across a narrative.
Right. That's some fascinating research project work, and I guess some theories that are emerging around this problem space. I'm curious to get your hot take on another thought. We had a fella on the program a while back, Bob Jones. He's done a lot of work with SOCOM. Oh, he works at SOCOM currently, actually, but he has done a lot of thinking on governance and managing subgroups within a larger nation state. And one of his takeaways that I'm recalling, at least, was that it's really important to try to take or to understand the perspective of the aggrieved party. And his way of putting it is, or my way of putting it, I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that every group that has a problem with the government or with the world, there's like a little slice of truth in what they are having a problem about. Now, the way they're navigating the world and the way they're bullying people around or causing violence, I mean, that's completely unacceptable. But being able to understand what the little kernel of truth that is the core of their problem goes a long way towards being able to um, uh, let the air out of the balloon a little bit and actually start the healing process or something like that. What do you think about that kind of notion as a tactic or approach in this space?
I could not agree more. It's exactly why I like to think that extremism, disinformation do not happen in a vacuum, that there are legitimate grievances that you have to address. And sometimes, information operations just aren't going to cut it because you still haven't addressed what it is that they are dealing with. So in that sense, I'm a huge proponent, and I'm very personally interested in what we can do with participatory governance or even civic engagement programs. I think you addressed this actually in the previous conversation, but I agree with anyone who is looking at civic engagement as one potential approach beyond just schools. Starting in schools is great, and obviously not. I'm speaking more domestically right now, but I think that in terms of addressing those grievances, acknowledging that people do have legitimate grievances, we then need to give them the tools to be able to address those. And especially domestically, I feel that a large part of the population has forgotten that they can address things at their local level. There's been a great decline in participation in civic associations over the decades for many reasons. But I would very much like to think through, how do we reinvigorate that? How do we give people the tools to start to remind them of the agency that they hold at their local level, beyond just, of course, voting at the local level, but there are so many different ways that you can be involved. And I personally am interested in seeing if we can't build new models of social media companies that actually link civic engagement in that respect. Again, starting it in schools, but then taking it beyond as children become adults. How do they then put what they've learned into practice? It's all about grounding people in their environments, reminding them of the agency that they have to create change, and then giving them the tools to do so.
Yes, I believe you're referring to the conversation that I had with Suzanne Spaulding a couple of months ago. Yeah, she did talk about civics and the need for some revitalized civics education, which is appropriate for our times. Absolutely. My goodness, Christina Nemr, you've given us a whole lot to think about. We'll have links to as many of these concepts and items that you mentioned as possible in the show notes. And with that, Christina Nemr, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.